March 14, 1978. 11:47 p.m. A basement apartment on Tunlaw Road, Northwest Washington, D.C. A man in his early 40s, wearing a rumpled Oxford shirt and horn-rimmed glasses, sits at a Formica kitchen table under fluorescent light. Before him, a Minox camera, a stack of classified State Department cables, and a glass of cheap bourbon. His hands are steady as he photographs each page. The shutter clicks metronomic, mechanical. Upstairs, his wife watches Johnny Carson. 3 blocks away, in a parked Chevrolet Impala, another man sits with a telephoto lens and a logbook, recording the time, the lit window, the shadow moving behind thin curtains. The man at the table is a mid-level analyst at the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research. The man in the Impala is Special Agent Robert Hansen of the FBI's Washington Field Office, Soviet Counterintelligence Squad. What neither knows yet is that within 18 months, one will be arrested for espionage, and the other will become the most damaging mole in American intelligence history. But on this cold March night, the machinery of betrayal and detection turns in perfect, oblivious synchrony. To understand how the FBI penetrated one of the most sophisticated Soviet intelligence networks operating on American soil during the late Cold War, you have to go back to the architecture of paranoia that defined Washington in the 1970s. The decade had been catastrophic for American counterintelligence. Watergate had gutted institutional trust. The Church Committee hearings had exposed decades of domestic surveillance abuses, crippling the FBI's ability to conduct aggressive operations against foreign intelligence services. The CIA was reeling from revelations about assassination plots and mind control experiments. Meanwhile, Soviet intelligence, the KGB's first chief directorate, and the GRU's foreign military intelligence apparatus, operated with unprecedented aggression and sophistication on U.S. territory. By 1978, the FBI's Soviet Counterintelligence Division estimated that more than 2,000 Soviet and Eastern Bloc intelligence officers operated under diplomatic cover in the United States, supported by an unknown number of illegals, deep cover agents with false identities, and a sprawling network of American citizens recruited as sources. The ratio was staggering. For every FBI counterintelligence agent, there were perhaps 15 hostile intelligence officers. The Bureau was outmanned, outfunded, and operating under legal constraints that Soviet intelligence exploited ruthlessly. Surveillance required court orders. Wiretaps demanded probable cause. Recruitment of sources within Soviet establishments was nearly impossible due to diplomatic immunity and internal KGB security protocols. The Soviets, by contrast, operated under no such limitations. They could recruit, blackmail, and run agents with impunity, knowing that even if caught, the worst consequence was expulsion. This was the ecosystem in which the FBI had to hunt. The target that would eventually lead to one of the Bureau's most significant Cold War penetrations was a network the FBI internally designated Crystal. The network had first surfaced in fragments during the mid-1970s through a combination of signals intelligence, defector debriefings, and anomaly detection in classified document handling. The National Security Agency had intercepted encrypted Soviet communications referencing a high-value source with access to State Department intelligence products. A KGB defector who walked into the U.S. Embassy in Vienna in 1976 provided partial corroboration. He described a Washington-based network run by a GRU illegal, using the cover of a minor diplomatic functionary, tasked with collecting political and military intelligence on NATO, arms control negotiations, and U.S. policy toward the Soviet Union. The defector did not know the American sources' identities, but he described tradecraft, dead drops in Rock Creek Park, signal sites using chalk marks on mailboxes, encrypted shortwave radio communications, and payments made through a cutout who posed as a rare book dealer. The FBI opened a counterintelligence investigation in early 1977, but progress was glacial. The Bureau had no physical surveillance of the suspected GRU handler, no identified American sources, and no legal basis for intrusive monitoring. What they had was a theory and a handful of intercepts that suggested the network was still active. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. Financial anomalies flagged by the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, a nascent interagency effort to track money laundering and suspicious transactions. In late 1977, an analyst noticed a pattern involving a rare book dealer named Victor Leskov, who operated a small shop in Georgetown. Leskov, a naturalized U.S. citizen originally from Czechoslovakia, had been in the country since 1968. His business was modest, his tax filings unremarkable. But over a 6-month period, he had made cash deposits totaling nearly $40,000, an amount inconsistent with the revenue profile of a niche antiquarian business. The deposits were structured just below the $10,000 reporting threshold, a classic money laundering technique. Treasury flagged the case and referred it to the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division, which in turn cross-referenced Leskov's name against ongoing counterintelligence investigations. The match was immediate. Leskov's profile aligned perfectly with the defector's description of the Crystal Network's financial cutout. The FBI requested and received a warrant to place Leskov under physical surveillance and to monitor his financial transactions. What they discovered over the next 4 months was a textbook example of Soviet tradecraft adapted to American legal and cultural terrain. Leskov operated with discipline and caution. He rarely met the same person twice in the same location. His movements followed no predictable pattern. He used public transportation, paid cash for everything, and never carried identification that could link him to anything beyond his bookshop. But surveillance teams noticed recurring behaviors. Every 2 weeks, Leskov would take a late afternoon walk through Georgetown, always carrying a leather satchel, always stopping at a specific bench near the C&O Canal. He would sit, read a newspaper, and leave. 30 minutes later, a different individual would arrive, sit on the same bench, retrieve something from beneath it, and depart. The FBI identified 3 separate individuals who participated in this pattern over the course of the surveillance period. 2 were low-level State Department employees with security clearances. The third was a Defense Intelligence Agency analyst. None had any known connection to each other. None had any obvious financial distress or ideological motivation that would flag them in routine security vetting. They were, in the language of counterintelligence, clean skins, individuals with no prior indicators of risk, making them ideal recruitment targets for patient, professional intelligence services. The decision facing the FBI was operationally and legally complex. Arresting Leskov and the 3 suspected sources would dismantle the network, but yield limited intelligence about Soviet methods, handlers, and broader operations. The evidence was circumstantial: physical proximity, financial anomalies, but not definitive proof of espionage. A competent defense attorney could argue coincidence, and the Classified Information Procedures Act would make it nearly impossible to introduce the most damning evidence, NSA intercepts and defector testimony, without compromising sources and methods. Moreover, dismantling Crystal prematurely might alert the Soviets to the FBI's detection capabilities, causing other networks to go dormant or change tradecraft. The alternative was riskier but potentially transformative. Instead of dismantling the network, penetrate it. Insert an FBI agent into the operational chain, either by turning one of the American sources or by creating a false identity that could be recruited by Soviet intelligence. The goal would be to map the entire network, identify the GRU handlers, document tradecraft, and ultimately feed controlled information back to Moscow while protecting genuine secrets. This was the logic that led to the decision, made in a secure conference room at FBI headquarters in May 1978, to launch what would become one of the Bureau's most audacious Cold War operations: the insertion of Special Agent Robert Hansen into the Crystal Network as a double agent. Hansen was not the obvious choice. At 34, he was relatively junior within the Soviet counterintelligence division, having joined the FBI only in 1976 after a brief, undistinguished career as a Chicago police officer and accountant. He was socially awkward, intellectually arrogant, and widely disliked by colleagues who found him condescending and paranoid. But he possessed qualities that made him uniquely suited for the operation. He had a graduate degree in business administration and a facility with financial analysis, which would be essential for understanding and documenting the network's money flows. He was fluent in Russian, having studied the language obsessively during college. He had an encyclopedic knowledge of Soviet intelligence history and tradecraft, the result of years spent reading classified debriefings and technical manuals. Most importantly, he was willing. When approached by his supervisors with the outline of the operation, Hansen did not hesitate. He saw it as an opportunity to prove his worth, to demonstrate that he was more than a desk-bound analyst, to become the kind of operative he had always imagined himself to be. What his supervisors did not fully grasp, what perhaps Hansen himself did not fully grasp, was the psychological complexity of the role he was about to assume. To convincingly pose as a traitor, he would have to think like one, to inhabit the motivations and justifications of betrayal so thoroughly that the performance became indistinguishable from reality. The operational plan was methodical. Hansen would not approach Soviet intelligence directly. That would trigger suspicion. Instead, the FBI would engineer a scenario in which the Soviets would recruit him. The mechanism was elegant. Hansen would be transferred to a newly created position within the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research, ostensibly as a liaison officer responsible for coordinating counterintelligence matters between state and the FBI. The position was real, the bureaucratic justification sound, but the underlying purpose was to place Hansen in an environment where he would have access to classified intelligence products and where his presence would be visible to Soviet intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover. To make him an attractive target, the FBI crafted a legend, a false but plausible backstory that suggested vulnerability. Hansen was portrayed as financially strained due to his wife's medical expenses, resentful of being passed over for promotion, and ideologically disillusioned with the FBI's post-Watergate constraints. The legend was seeded through carefully orchestrated conversations in settings known to be monitored by Soviet intelligence. A Georgetown bar frequented by diplomats, a reception at the Soviet embassy's Cultural Affairs office, a chance encounter at a bookstore, Leskov's bookstore, where Hansen made a point of purchasing a rare edition of a Russian novel and engaging Leskov in conversation about Soviet literature. The bait was set. The question was whether the Soviets would bite. They did. 6 weeks after Hansen's first visit to Leskov's shop, he received a handwritten note slipped into his State Department mailbox. The note was brief, unsigned, and written in English with faintly awkward syntax. It suggested a meeting to discuss matters of mutual interest and provided a time, date, and location: a bench in Montrose Park. a small wooded public space in Georgetown, at 8 p.m. on a Thursday evening. Hansen reported the contact immediately to his FBI handlers, and a surveillance plan was activated. On the appointed evening, Hansen arrived at the bench carrying a briefcase containing a concealed recording device and a stack of low-level classified documents that had been carefully selected and sanitized by FBI analysts, material that appeared valuable but contained no genuinely sensitive information. The man who approached him was not Leskov, but a younger individual, mid-30s, well-dressed, speaking English with a slight accent that Hansen's trained ear identified as Eastern European, possibly Polish or Czech. The man introduced himself as Peter, offered no surname, and wasted no time on pleasantries. He said he represented friends who valued Hansen's expertise and were prepared to compensate him generously for his assistance in understanding American policy perspectives on arms control and European security. The language was coded, deniable, but the meaning was unambiguous. Hansen responded with calculated hesitation, expressing concern about risk, asking how he could be certain of confidentiality. Peter reassured him. The arrangement would be discreet, the compensation substantial, and the material requested would be limited to analytical assessments, nothing that would endanger American lives. It was a lie, of course, but a lie delivered with practiced sincerity. Hansen agreed to consider the proposal and to meet again in 2 weeks. Over the next 6 months, Hansen met with Peter 4 more times, each meeting carefully choreographed by the FBI to advance the operation's objectives. Hansen provided documents, all of them vetted and controlled, and received payments in cash, which he immediately turned over to his handlers. The meetings allowed the FBI to map the network's communication protocols, identify additional cutouts, and begin to trace the financial flows back to Soviet diplomatic accounts. But the operation's true value lay in what Hansen was learning about Soviet intelligence methods. Peter was cautious, professional, and methodical. He never asked for information outside Hansen's apparent access. He never pressed when Hansen expressed reluctance. He used classic elicitation techniques, flattery, ideological alignment, appeals to intellectual vanity, to build rapport and deepen commitment. He introduced Hansen to the concept of the dead drop, explaining that future exchanges would occur without face-to-face contact to minimize risk. He provided Hansen with a detailed map marking locations in Rock Creek Park, where materials could be left and retrieved, along with a system of signal sites, chalk marks on mailboxes, specific arrangements of objects on windowsills to indicate when a drop had been loaded or cleared. The tradecraft was sophisticated, layered with redundancy and operational security measures designed to protect both the source and the handler. Hansen documented everything, and the FBI began to construct a comprehensive picture of how the Crystal Network functioned. But as the operation progressed, Hansen's handlers began to notice subtle changes in his behavior and reporting. He became more secretive, more resistant to debriefing, more insistent on controlling the flow of information to the Soviets without consulting his supervisors. He began to express frustration with the FBI's bureaucratic caution, arguing that the operation could yield far greater intelligence if he were allowed to provide more sensitive material. Not genuinely classified secrets, he assured them, but documents that would appear more valuable and thus elicit more trust and information from Peter. His supervisors denied the requests, but Hansen's persistence was troubling. There were other anomalies. Financial records showed that Hansen had made several large cash deposits into a personal account, deposits that exceeded the amounts he had reported receiving from Peter. When questioned, Hansen explained that the discrepancies were due to delayed reimbursements from the Bureau for Operational Expenses. but the explanation was vague and inconsistent. Surveillance logs indicated that Hansen had made several unexplained trips to locations near known Soviet diplomatic facilities, trips that were not part of the approved operational plan. His supervisors began to ask a question that, in the context of counterintelligence, is both inevitable and terrifying. Had the double agent become a double-double agent? Had Hansen, in the process of pretending to betray his country, actually begun to do so? The FBI's response was to tighten control. Hansen was placed under discreet internal surveillance. His financial transactions were monitored. His communications were reviewed. His meetings with Peter were observed not only to gather intelligence on the Soviets, but to ensure that Hansen was adhering to the operational script. What the FBI discovered was ambiguous. There was no definitive evidence of genuine betrayal, but there were patterns of behavior that suggested Hansen was operating with a degree of autonomy that exceeded his authorization. He was making decisions in real time during meetings with Peter, providing information and making commitments without prior approval. He was developing a relationship with his Soviet handler that appeared to go beyond the professional detachment expected of a controlled double agent. In the language of counterintelligence psychology, Hansen was exhibiting signs of identification with the role, a phenomenon in which an operative begins to internalize the identity they are performing, blurring the line between mission and reality. The risk was that Hansen, in his desire to be the perfect double agent, might become the very thing he was pretending to be. The decision to terminate the operation was made in early 1979, not because the FBI had conclusive evidence of Hansen's betrayal, but because the risks had begun to outweigh the intelligence gains. The operation had succeeded in mapping the Crystal network, identifying key players, and documenting Soviet tradecraft. But it had also revealed the inherent instability of double-agent operations, the psychological toll on the operative, the difficulty of maintaining control, the ever-present possibility that the operation could invert. Hansen was quietly reassigned to a desk position at FBI headquarters. His contact with Peter severed, the Crystal network placed under continued surveillance but no longer actively penetrated. The official explanation was that Hansen's cover had been compromised and that continuing the operation would endanger him. The unofficial reality was that the FBI no longer trusted him. Within 6 months, the Bureau moved to dismantle Crystal entirely. Leskov and the 3 American sources were arrested in coordinated raids in September 1979. The evidence was overwhelming. Documents, recordings, financial records, and testimony from Hansen himself, who was called to testify in closed proceedings about the network's operations. All 3 sources were convicted under the Espionage Act. Leskov, facing deportation and a lengthy prison sentence, agreed to cooperate and provided detailed debriefings about GRU methods and personnel. The case was hailed as a major counterintelligence success, a demonstration that the FBI could penetrate and dismantle sophisticated Soviet networks despite legal and resource constraints. But the story did not end there. In the years following the Crystal operation, Hansen's career within the FBI followed a strange, troubling trajectory. He was promoted, given positions of increasing responsibility within the Soviet counterintelligence division, granted access to some of the most sensitive intelligence programs in the U.S. government. He became a specialist in technical surveillance, in signals intelligence, in the very methods used to detect and monitor hostile intelligence activities. He was trusted, respected, and feared for his intellect and his knowledge. And all the while, unbeknownst to his colleagues, he was selling secrets to the Soviet Union and later to the Russian Federation, on a scale that dwarfed anything the Crystal network had accomplished. The betrayal began, according to Hansen's later confessions, in 1985, 6 years after the end of the Crystal operation. He initiated contact with the KGB by mailing a letter to a Soviet diplomat, offering classified information in exchange for payment. He provided the names of American double agents working for the FBI and CIA within Soviet intelligence, leading to their arrests and executions. He disclosed technical details about U.S. surveillance capabilities, compromising billions of dollars in intelligence programs. He continued his espionage for 15 years, until his arrest in 2001, making him one of the most damaging spies in American history. The question that haunts the Crystal case is whether the FBI's operation created the very monster it sought to combat. Did the experience of pretending to be a traitor, of inhabiting that role so completely, of receiving payments, of deceiving handlers, of operating in the moral and psychological twilight of double agent work, plant the seed of Hansen's later betrayal? Or was Hansen always predisposed to treachery, his participation in Crystal merely a rehearsal for the real performance to come? The FBI's internal review, conducted after Hansen's arrest, concluded that there were warning signs during the Crystal operation: the financial anomalies, the unauthorized decisions, the psychological identification with the role, but that the significance of those signs was not fully understood at the time. The review acknowledged that the Bureau had failed to recognize the psychological risks inherent in double agent operations, the ways in which the performance of betrayal could become indistinguishable from betrayal itself. It recommended enhanced psychological screening and monitoring for operatives involved in such roles, along with stricter controls and more frequent debriefings. But it could not answer the deeper question: whether some individuals, when placed in the position of simulating treason, discover within themselves a capacity and a desire for the real thing. What remains known about the Crystal operation comes from a combination of trial records, declassified FBI documents, and Hansen's own debriefings after his arrest. The 3 American sources convicted in 1979 served sentences ranging from 12 to 20 years. Leskov was deported to Czechoslovakia in 1982 and disappeared into obscurity. It is believed he was debriefed by Soviet intelligence and then quietly retired. The GRU handler identified as Peter was never apprehended. He left the United States in late 1979 under diplomatic cover and was never publicly named. The dead drop sites in Rock Creek Park were quietly monitored by the FBI for years afterward, occasionally yielding evidence of other unrelated espionage activities. The signal sites, chalk marks, window arrangements became part of the FBI's institutional knowledge, a catalog of Soviet tradecraft that would inform counterintelligence operations for decades. The financial mechanisms used by Leskov were studied and incorporated into Treasury Department protocols for detecting money laundering and espionage funding. In this sense, the Crystal operation succeeded in its immediate objectives. It dismantled a network, it gathered intelligence, it refined methods. But its legacy is inseparable from the larger, darker story of Robert Hansen, the man who penetrated the network and who, in doing so, may have discovered his own capacity for betrayal. The broader implications of the Crystal case extend beyond the specifics of one network or one operative. It reveals the fundamental asymmetry of Cold War counterintelligence. The Soviets could recruit, run, and sacrifice agents with relative impunity, while the FBI operated under legal, political, and moral constraints that limited its options and amplified its risks. It demonstrates the psychological complexity of espionage, the ways in which identity, loyalty, and morality become unstable when individuals are asked to inhabit roles that require them to simulate the very behaviors they are meant to oppose. It underscores the difficulty of detecting betrayal when the betrayer is an insider, someone with access, knowledge, and trust, someone who understands the systems designed to catch him because he helped design them. And it raises uncomfortable questions about the costs of counterintelligence success. Whether the methods used to penetrate hostile networks, deception, manipulation, psychological pressure, inevitably corrupt the operatives who employ them. Whether the fight against espionage requires a willingness to become, in some measure, what one is fighting against. In the end, the Crystal operation is a case study in the ambiguities and paradoxes of intelligence work during the Cold War. It was a success by the metrics that mattered at the time. Arrests, convictions, intelligence gained, networks dismantled. But it was also a failure in ways that would not become fully apparent for more than 2 decades, when the man who had been its most valuable asset was revealed to be its greatest liability. The operation demonstrated that the FBI could match Soviet intelligence in tradecraft and operational sophistication, but it also revealed the limits of institutional control, the unpredictability of human psychology, and the dangers of asking individuals to perform roles that require them to betray the very values they are meant to uphold. It showed that, in the world of espionage, the line between hunter and hunted, between loyalty and betrayal, between performance and reality, is far thinner and more permeable than anyone wants to believe. And it left behind a question that remains unanswered, perhaps unanswerable. Whether the FBI's decision to insert Hansen into the Crystal network was a brilliant stroke of counterintelligence, or the first step in creating one of the most damaging traitors in American history. What is certain is that the Crystal case, like so many Cold War operations, exists in the space between triumph and tragedy, between what was achieved and what was lost, between the secrets that were protected and the secrets that were sold. It is a reminder that espionage is not a game of chess, with clear rules and predictable outcomes, but a contest of wills, identities, and moral compromises, played out in the shadows by individuals who must navigate the treacherous terrain between duty and temptation, between the roles they perform and the people they become. The Dangan remain partially classified, the full truth obscured by layers of secrecy and institutional self-protection. But the story of how the FBI infiltrated a Soviet spy ring in Washington, and of what that infiltration cost, endures as one of the most complex and troubling chapters in the history of American counterintelligence.